Got it. Okay. So really what we were hoping to do was to come up with this really big inventory of all the different guidance and then give people an opportunity to figure out where they are in the data management process and maybe jump into it at whatever stage they're at, or whichever piece they're having troubles with, or if they're trying to start up a project, how do they start in the beginning and move through the process to a place where they're able to describe how they've pulled their data together and can anticipate how it can be used. And so this was the dream, to have the choose your own adventure. Until then, we have what we're sharing today is the compendium. Click. Thanks, Hillary. Um, we have the compendium, which is now on the CSA website. Click again. And we'll be talking a little bit more in detail. Hillary's going to describe how we built it. Um, and then the next slide, click again. Just so that you have a sense of it, right now we have about 28 resources in there. We've spent some time digging into how it fills out. And we know that while citizen science spans nearly all disciplinary areas of science, the majority of resources that we have in the compendium right now are focused on considerations for water quality and biodiversity monitoring. And probably because most of us are based in the US, it's mostly US based organizations that have resources in the compendium right now. And you can tell from this little map, which has the 8 stages of data management: plan, collect, assure, describe, preserve, discover, and oh gosh, I can't see the last one, and analyze, integrate and analyze. We have far fewer resources in the latter stages of the data management cycle. So the preserve, discover, integrate, and analyze stages are a little bit underrepresented. So it's probably the case that these gaps are because it wasn't in our purview of the people who have been pulling together the compendium so far. And I'm sure that it's also because, starting with the planning, the quality assurance project plans, for example, have gotten a lot of emphasis from EPA and now NOAA and a lot of the state agencies that want to use citizen science data. So there have been a lot of project resources developed there. But this is one of the reasons we're having this webinar and working session today, is to try and make sure that we're pulling in as much as we can from as far, as broad a swath as we can. So on the final slide, Hillary, which has a couple little clicky clicks, it is a living library. We want to make sure that this continues to grow and keeps up as more resources are pulled together. And so, ding, if we still want to reach our dream of having a more interactive way of going into the compendium, you'll see some of the guts of it as we work together after we talk a little bit. But it is right now an Excel spreadsheet set up as a pivot table, which is good, and I think it's really pretty easy to find things, but it could be a lot more friendly. So if there's anybody who's interested in working with the working group on that, that would be fantastic. The next thing we want to do is just encourage you to use, there's a Google form right with the compendium. There's a little share a resource button on the working group product page that brings you to a Google form that you can fill out, and it sends us quite a bit of information that gets us rolling with a new resource. So if you don't have time to get into it with us coming up next, definitely take a look at the compendium as it stands, and if you know of any resources, you can add more. And then the final thing that we hope you'll do is to hang out with us today or into the future. Hillary will describe how it's built, but one of the things that we do is that we want to make sure that each resource is reviewed by two people so that the entries for each of them has two eyeballs looking at it, or four eyeballs, I guess, looking at them, and making sure that there's some agreement on what is there and what people can get out of them. So, Hillary, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, so I am just going to first introduce myself. My name is Hillary Burgess, and I am the monitoring coordinator with NOAA's Marine Debris Program. So, situated in a federal agency leading a citizen science project. But when I first started working on this project in 2017 with Pam, I was at the University of Washington. And one of the projects I did as a graduate student was studying the barriers to use of citizen science for scientific goals. And of course, data quality is a resounding theme. And so this was a natural project to try to sort of tackle that challenge. And as Pam said, up our game collectively as a community of practice. And so the process of taking that initial dream to the reality that it is today was very collaborative. So Pam and I agreed to sort of tag team the leading of the project, but there were a number of volunteers within the Citizen Science Association that got involved in different stages. So the process looked like this. We inventoried the resources that were already out there. So we focused on mostly like reports and websites rather than peer-reviewed publications. So really resources on data quality that were geared towards practitioners as tools for considering some part of the data quality and data management lifecycle. So we did that through internet search, and we kind of crowdsourced ID'd existing resources, and that formed the basis of basically this library. And then we worked collaboratively to define what kind of information we wanted to gather about those resources in order to make this library useful. So there's a lot out there. Which resources are most useful for you at the stage that you're at or the discipline that you're working in? Probably not all resources are relevant to everybody. So how do you find what you need? Hopefully there's already something out there that is relevant to what you're working on. But sometimes it's just a matter of finding the right thing. So we decided what categories of information we wanted to collect, and then worked to kind of hone a coding system to make sure that we were defining those categories for each resource consistently. And that's one reason we had at least two pairs of eyes on each resource as we were reviewing it. And I'll give you a tour of the compendium in a minute to give you a sense of what that looks like. And then we held a series of working sessions. So we found that it was really pleasant and helpful to basically, for this kind of collaborative project that's extracurricular for all of us, to set working sessions ahead of time, be on a Zoom meeting, even if we were working independently, kind of make it a social thing where we could ask each other questions and bounce ideas off of one another as we were kind of grinding through reviewing each resource and completing an entry in the compendium itself. And once we felt fairly satisfied that we were as comprehensive as we could be at the time, we worked with the main CSA webmaster to get the compendium hosted on the CSA website and to host some webinars to start socializing the fact that this resource of resources was out there, and to invite folks to submit additions to help us fill any gaps. Of course, the launch happened to coincide sort of right with COVID as things were shutting down. And so we're thinking of this sort of as a re-debut and an opportunity to do an update. Basically, we're thinking about at least an annual cycle of updating to make sure that we have all the relevant resources in there. So as Pam mentioned, it's meant to be a living document, living resource. So you can see here, like if you are on the CSI webpage and you've landed on the Compendium resource site, there's an option to view the compendium, and there's also an option to add a resource. That add a resource button takes you to a form that essentially completes an entry in the compendium. It still has to be entered manually into the compendium. That would be one cool thing for a web savvy person to develop, would be a direct link. But that's how it works right now. And so for today, we actually have a few new entries that we know need to be added. And we would like to invite this group to help us identify any additional resources that have come out in recent time or from different places than what we identified to make this as comprehensive as possible. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing slides and bring us into the compendium itself to give you a tour. So bear with me while I do the tech.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hillary, I thought we could ask if there are any questions in the meantime about how we did this or why, while we wait for the next step. Okay.
Yeah, don't feel shy about chiming in, especially in transition. Just now, again, in meeting mode, you can unmute yourself briefly if you want to ask a question and clarification in advance of getting into the more conversational part of this session.
Hi, this is Vincent. I put some questions in the chat about accessibility and training for, I mean, you know, community don't come with the background expertise in these. So we need a one-on-one for dummies in this kind of things created to help community get more, engaged in this, and also how can we use gaming so people get access and start practicing on utilizing the tools. It's something we need to look at. Are you?
Thanks, Vincent.
I can jump in there, Vincent. I don't think you're the only one who needs like the overview of how does this all work at a kind of high level to just ground. People are coming to citizen science, we know, from so many different areas of expertise, that having that kind of a big picture flow that doesn't have a lot of detail, but just kind of gives the overview with some annotation might be a really useful tool. So I've been thinking about that in my own space. So I'm seconding that idea. It's a good one.
Yeah, and I think it echoes one of the things that Hillary mentioned, or Pam, I apologize, maybe it was you, in terms of thinking about the format that this compendium takes and how to make it available and also usable. So I think it's going to be a great conversation after we see what's here and ways that all of you can make recommendations.
I'd like to see an animation that shows the instructions how to do it. While you click on the animation and it shows you exactly what to do. I think that's something that we need to look at.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And that's the thing. We're thinking of this as more of a kind of the skeleton that will add all these other pieces to it, so it's not quite so scary. So yes, thank you very much for those good ideas about how to make it less scary.
And the flow that you've already started, like linking the resources to the different steps, I think it's a great step forward for that. So I don't mean to say that you haven't done it yet, because I think that's really in the right direction, but more of that might be useful.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is something that we were trying to uncover in this process was there are all these resources that are already out there, publications and reports and things like that, but is it that what's needed already exists and it's a matter of finding the right thing, or is it that something new really needs to be created that makes these concepts more accessible and really walks folks through in this sort of 101 approach? And it's great to hear, actually, it's helpful to hear, I think, that there is a need for something a little different that maybe distills the information that is already out there in a way that is more usable. So
yeah, Hillary, you've probably seen that, but that's being echoed in the chat as well. So I think there are some great ideas coming out here. Do you want to walk us through what is here? I think that will probably surface some additional ideas and questions.
great, yeah. So can folks, I'll share my screen, but I'm hoping folks can also follow along in the compendium itself. So I'm going to pop the link in. I think Rihanna did also earlier, but just to do that again, it looks like a lot of folks are in here. So I'm going to give you a tour. Right now, as you can see, it's in the format of a spreadsheet, which is not always the most user-friendly or navigable kind of structure, but this is what was free and easily accessible to us to get this process started. And so the first tab in the spreadsheet, it says resource metadata. What that means is this is where the library exists of existing citizen science data quality resources. Each row is a resource that we identified, and each column is information about that resource. So the top one here is a data management guide for public participation in scientific research. It was published by Data One. There's a link to it. And then beyond that, there's a series of other information about that resource. So you could search on, let's say the topic area that you're working in is water quality or biodiversity or astronomy. Those are the kinds of keywords you could search on and then see if there are resources specific to your area. Or you can identify resources that touch on a particular part of the data life cycle. So is it about planning a new project and what considerations for data quality you should have in mind as you're planning a new project and designing it? Or is it about how you actually analyze the data that you have already? There are resources that exist for each of those components of a project. And then if you scroll all the way to the right, in addition to the different categories, there's information about who did the review of that resource, when it was last updated, and so this is where you see initials for the many people who were involved in putting this together. So those are the reviewer names. There's also information about kind of whether there's case studies within the document and that you can follow along to see examples. Who the audience is intended. Is it intended for academics? Is it intended for practitioners, folks that are just kind of getting started? So that's the first tab. The next tab describes each, it's called field descriptions. It describes each column and why we collected that information about each resource and how we defined it. So some of them are pretty self-explanatory, like who the reviewers were. Others are need a little bit of explanation, like how did we define the format that the resource was in? Is it available as a website that's interactive? Is it just a static PDF? Who created it in the first place? So this is just to ensure that kind of we're all thinking about this information in the same way and to make a record of it. Pam, is there anything you want to add about this process?
No, well, yes, because I'm about to say something. I was about to say no. Yes, because I feel like just through this process, I learned a lot about being conscious of metadata, and the fact that we used metadata to think about metadata was really pretty awesome and a little freaky. And so it
So
was,
meta.
yes, exactly, very meta. And and so that's just something I wanted to share, is that just by working on this project, it was great to have a team that knows what's out there in terms of data and metadata practices, best practices, and it improved how I think about things, and that it's brought into this process, I think is really helpful, because it we're practicing what we preach, really.
Right on.
How
Yes.
easy is it to get this data and be able to scrape like onto an EJ screen? If that's something also that we may need to look at, how we can make them interactive with each other, two different formats to create new data and be able to do more. I mean, I think that's something that is actually needed. So just want to put that out there. Hey, you.
Yeah, this is less linked to locations or geographic areas than it is to steps in data management process. And I think that there are a lot of examples where, especially the tribal nations, have gotten a lot of funding from EPA, for example, to do um, their own monitoring air quality, especially, and they've produced a lot of good resources that we should be including in the compendium that we haven't scraped them up yet.
Thanks, Pam. Pam and Hillary, I know you talked about moving this into a more brainstorming and contribution phase. I'm seeing some hands come up and some questions going around. Are there things that you want to share before we move into that? Or are you ready to get into the conversational session?
It's a good question. I think this time and space should be kind of community driven. So I believe that we have covered kind of the real bases of what we have done thus far, and the thought for our time here was really to figure out opportunities for updating and improving, and then certainly to identify gaps or next steps that might best serve the needs of our community and how we might get there. So I'm super happy to open it up. I think the documentation is here and available, and folks can explore it. And most of you are in it, so that's great.
Great. Well, I will just note, Laura, glad you're here and you have access to this now to dig in deeper and share ideas, questions on CSA Connect as well. These folks are all available. I know that there's probably going to be more questions than we can facilitate in the time and resources to be shared. The chat is a great spot for that. But also moving into putting your hand up, asking a question. We can do both of those things. I will just mention that Abram has already shared a link to his organization, the Center for Open Science, and others can feel free to do that as well if you have places to point out where you have resources that might go into some of this or conversations that you want to start around this. But maybe just to kick us off, I see Charmel's hand up, and Charmel is another member and co-chair of the data and metadata working group. You may have wanted to respond directly to the item that Pam was talking about, or you might want to move us into the next phase, but why don't you take it to go from here?
Thanks, Jennifer. No, I think it's great to start moving into maybe looking at the document a little bit closer. But Hillary, I'd love you to go over, you were going to go over adding a new document or updating one. I'd like to learn how you want to do that. And then after we do that, I have a suggestion maybe for another column, just because I'm a data and I'm a temporal data person. So one column I see that you have when it was the item was added and updated, but they're both, they could both be in the same, multiple dates in that field. So it's like one of your last columns. So I was thinking when it's added is good, but updated might not, updated / checked, because I was just like going through and wanting to check to see if the links are still there. It's not like we're updating it, but checked / updated would be maybe a second column. So when did we first put it there? And then when did we last check it? And that would be easy for me to query on, say, okay, we haven't checked anything in the, since 2019. So anyway, that's a food for thought, but I'd love first for you to go through adding one.
Yeah, so the easiest way to add one is through one of these working sessions. So right now, here we are. We should all be in the document and have access. And you can literally, you should all have edit privileges. If you don't, you can request them. But you should be able to directly add a row and begin. And anything that's in yellow is that's been highlighted in yellow needs work. It's either something new that someone has added that now needs a full entry, or is incomplete or needs another set of eyes because only one person has checked it out. The other option is to, if you happen to think of something and it's not during this meeting, but after the fact, you can go to the site the CSA website, there under the resources tab, click data and metadata, and it takes you to the Compendium landing page, and there's an add a resource button. And that takes you to a Google form that actually each field matches the columns in this spreadsheet. And so, and you can fill them out completely to kind of give us a leg up in the entry in the compendium, or you can just put the resource and know that it'll be gotten to at a working session. So the items that have been populated here that need work are mostly ones that were suggested by the Greater Citizen Science Association community through that form. But I suspect there are others that we don't even know about. Let's see.
Nancy, thanks for just joining. I just got you joining the data and metadata working group. I just approved it, saw it. So it's a private group. So Nancy did the great thing. She just clicked to join. We get a little notice, we approve it. And underneath the data and metadata to continue the conversation on the compendium, we have a topic. So if you go underneath the data and metadata working group and CSA Connect, there's a topic for the data quality resource compendium. And I'll put the link in here, but you have to kind of, I don't know what happens if you go directly to the link and you're not a member of the group. I don't know how that works. So anyway, thanks, Nancy.
Charmel, to clarify though, the compendium itself is available to everyone, right? Yeah.
Yes, yes. It's just it's a little bit of a chatting conversation. Like if we want to continue promote CSA Connect if we want to continue some other kind of conversations, especially about what Hillary and Pam and Vincent was commenting on, the next steps, the next, version. Of course, the compendium needs to continue to be updated, but how can we move it to be a little bit more user friendly?
Yeah. So I think maybe there are two things, two potential threads, not that there aren't many more than two, but two potential threads that I'm hearing going on here are, all right, what are we missing? Where are there resources that aren't included here, or where are there gaps in this where we need to go out and find resources? And Nancy, I think you're clarifying, is that what we want this conversation to be about? The other thread that I'm hearing is, okay, this is awesome. There's a set of resources here, and yeah, maybe it'll grow, but what do we do with this? How do we use it? How do we make it usable or useful? And I think that this conversation could go either way, but I want to go back to our host and say, what's your vision here? How can we enrich this conversation with some of these ideas?
So I would say that the beauty of the Zoom working sessions is that some people can chit chat and talk about things, while other people who would rather just be in working mode can go in and, do the little assessment of the documents that are there. So the 4 that are highlighted in yellow are ready for people to go through and either do a double check on or do a first round on. So if anybody feels like doing that while we have the conversation for the next 20 minutes, I would think that that's fine. Do you agree, Hillary? Oh, is she frozen? She looks a little frozen. Or am I frozen?
No, we can hear you, Pam. We
Okay.
might have lost Hillary temporarily. So the
Okay.
link is there. So what I'm hearing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the link is there if folks want to go in and curate some of these resources live time right now.
Right.
Yeah.
While we're working, and you can come back and ask questions about the different fields or things like that if you have those.
Okay. And then there's also the open space here right now if people have general questions as well. I know some of the things people might have been coming with are, where do I start, or what do I do regarding resources for data quality? So opening up, yeah.
And ideas for how to make this more accessible to more people. Yep.
Great. I see some great things in the chat too, if anybody wants to voice that, or again, we're a small group here, so feel free to either raise your hand or unmute to ask a question, add an idea.
Hey, Jennifer.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Was that Lisa?
Yes, it is. I so apologize for entering late. I had another commitment, but real quickly, I put it in the chat, the White House regarding the data collection and whether the data collection is standardized or ethical. I just put in the chat line there that there are different standards. It is Cybersecurity Month. There have been questionable actions about data collection and whether or not it's reputable, ethical. So those are some things that, with the CSA, we really need to be mindful about. Our code of conduct and our policy.
Thanks for pointing that out, Lisa. I think this is a great resource that we can bring attention to, and I'll let the data and metadata folks comment on that. Another parallel, since you brought this up, another parallel conversation that's been happening is on data ethics, specifically through a CSA partnership. And I'll put a link in the chat about some of the things that have been coming out of that specific for this field. So I'm glad you brought attention to this in this conversation.
Hey, Jennifer, also data needs to be vetted also for, because hate to give out wrong information, misinformation. That's something that's really important. So I think that needs to be included as well in the work.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. I know for a long time, one of the #1 questions in this field is, are the data any good? I think for the most part, we've moved past that as a field, but every project still has to address that. And it's going to be different for every project. That's a really important point. Anybody bring any burning questions with them in coming to this session?
I have a question.
Lisa.
You know, we're all speaking about data collection and such, but there are different open source methodology like OpenStreetMaps and other things that have, you know, different data to be used and such. And I have another call coming up this evening where inputting maps into a virtual tour program, I mean, we've already been denied. This is a NASA funded program, by the way, but we are now not allowed to use the NASA websites because, you know, of security methods. So now with OpenStreetMaps and other open source APIs, is anyone having any issues with using sources such as this with their programs? Is anyone having any, you know, when you try to put in, you know, everyone uses Google Maps, but when you use OpenStreetMaps or Zooniverse or you know, Citizen Science, and you want to input information from Antarctica into these incorporated virtual tour programs, is anyone having issues themselves with, you know, getting permission?
Lisa, I think I understand your question, but I want to make sure I understand your question. So is your question that, like, if you're trying to embed, so obviously countless websites embed a Google map into their website. If you're trying to embed like an OpenStreetMap web, is there difficulties in doing so? Or is it, I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right on the mark. Embedding it is one thing, but these are to be educational programs for historical, you know, STEAM education curriculum. And it's a 6-month funded program, which not to be released till January, February. But all of a sudden we were put on pause with using some of the NASA websites. So that occurred. Then Lunar Planetary Institute, it's like, okay, that's being held. So I don't know if it's something that has to do with the White House and the data collection, what's happening with the briefings and such, but I'll find out from this call coming up at 6 p.m. Eastern time that OpenStreetMaps is used for citizen science. We've used that for a good many years and it's reliable. So embedding it into a virtual program for educational programs, I felt if you're going to teach students or undergraduates, use the right resources. Don't go to Google Maps and rely that, you know what, Silicon Valley's having a fallout. It's not reliable. We're supposed to be the citizen scientists.
I see. Yeah. So in other words, yeah, that makes sense. So, you know, lead by example and use citizen generated information when and where possible is what I'm hearing. And
Absolutely. That way
yeah.
it's populated by us. We have our repositories. We have Zooniverse. We have other applications that are being used that are reliable and supported by, you know, Purple Air Quality.
Right.
The urban heat mapping program that I'm involved with. It's like, okay, I want to use these resources, but there's some roadblocks that are happening. And I don't know if it's just policy or, you know, they're holding off on citizen scientists to be able to be reliable for these measures.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Lisa, thank you for that. That's great. I think that there's yeah, we want to do everything we can to reduce those roadblocks. And, you know, I think I'm not sure if, can't remember the individual's name, Adam, I think, who was from the Center for Open Science would probably chime in here. But the advantage of some of those open source approaches is that they can be used without restriction based on the licensing and things like this nature. And so that's very valuable. I think that the barriers you might be witnessing are cultural, political, probably. So I think you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, those sorts of programs are available and can and should be used for sure. Yeah.
Hey, Greg, one
I have-
of my questions is like community, what if you get someone that's don't have any educational background, but you could go ahead and actually utilize this information? When I mentioned earlier screen scraping, that means being able to get the data and being put into a tool like an EJ screen so the data could be captured and placed in a location so you can come back in the future and do some follow-up work with the data that's going to be there. And it also has a place, it actually sets up a map to where what you're discussing, because the main thing community walks, because it's so much data being gathered and no results coming out from the gathering of data for a community. How can we turn around and turn that around to start producing some solutions and some action? That's what we actually need. So all this is great, but there's one more little linchpin in how we can turn this information into action. I yield.
It seems like
Vincent?
there's a few things happening here. There's this incredible compendium of resources for project leaders putting together projects well, managing data, thinking like doing the whole data process. But what's also surfacing is like Lisa's case of what do you do when you can't access the data you need to, or there's an issue with that. And then what I think I hear Vincent saying is, okay, now we have data. How do we know if it's good and what do we do with it once we have it? So we know we can take the next step. I think a challenge with this compendium, which is amazing, is there's so much in it. And there probably could be other things in it, but where do you draw the lines of what belongs in the compendium? And then what belongs maybe in a course like what Jennifer's been talking about developing around what are the first steps for data analysis, or what are the first steps for analyzing or assessing the quality of the data you've collected? We may not be able to answer all of the questions and all of the issues that are being raised on the call through the compendium. So figuring out what's going to be in it and what it's going to support and how to support those other needs that are surfacing might be a useful step.
Pam? Oh, you're muted.
Hillary, step on me if I go off on a tangent. But the idea is that the compendium is tied to the data management cycle that Data 1 defined. And so the data assessment step, you would go to that one and there will be resources that would help you think about how do I assess the data? How do I know it's going to meet the needs that I have? When I forget who brought up the ethics question earlier, but that one too, I think we need to figure out where that would sit in the data management cycle. And there should be, and if there isn't, that's something else I think we need to address. Where does it sit in the data management cycle? And so where would we highlight that as one of the keywords, that the ethics of the data? So I think that Kim, you have or Sarah, I'm sorry, Sarah, I think you're right that there is a lot in the compendium because it's kind of a compendium of many resources that are trying to fill many needs. And so that's really, we stopped short of trying to get into, what's the table of contents of this document, because that would have been a big monster. Um, and so as we were writing the descriptions, that's why there are so many columns, to try and give people a sense of what they'd be diving into once they click on that link.
Yeah, and it's agreed. It's when you have all this stuff here, how do you help people use it? I wonder if like an FAQ approach or a use case approach might help. Like, so you're a citizen science project leader who's collected some data and now you want to know what to do next. Where do you go in the compendium? What do you access? And then what else do you need to do? Scenarios like that might be a nice way to illustrate the use of this incredible resource. And I do think there are some things that we can all figure out on our own. Like if you give me the right paper, I can read it, I can understand it, and I can work through it. But there are some other things that it's just way more efficient and way more friendly and supportive and encouraging to talk to other people about it. So figuring out what are the scenarios and what are the challenges that can be handled by a list of resources like this, and then what are the kind of complementary courses might make sense. I know when
Sarah?
I first visited this, I was totally overwhelmed by all the pages and all the things in it. And then I started digging in and started realizing what was in the columns and how I could use those to find the things that would be useful for me. And that was like, oh man, this is like a library. And it was a big turning point. But I think some scenarios might help people who don't even know where to go, what they need right now might help.
Sarah, and for everyone here online, I don't know if you've experienced, but like as a citizen scientist, you know, appearing on a call last week that directly focused on the city of Charleston and urban heat mapping program. Now, in November 2019 to 2020, there was nothing for the city of Charleston about an urban heat mapping program. Yet I pushed and pushed and I supported, you know, the program to have a climate action program, which we now have ambassadors for the city. We were holding a call last week with NASA members and from the Climate Action Council on the call. All of the links that I shared as a citizen scientist from NASA, from resources, all the links, the information I shared was handsomely embraced. But you have to understand that these are higher educational institutions, that they want to hold on to their own data. They don't want to share. So that is sort of the hiccup that I am experiencing myself in the city of Charleston, because it's a tri-county region. We have the urban heat mapping, we have the flood mitigation, and I also threw in the component that, look, we have also humanities of health and human resources because of the Zika virus. Through the GLOW program with Rusty Lowe, I was following the Zika virus, and lo and behold, we had that compounded with COVID, plus hurricanes, flooding, and urban heat issues. So as an individual, I've shared a wealth of information, and the universities are very grateful for it, but they take that information and then they hold it in their own database. You understand? I've had professors reach out to me personally and ask, what can I use for databases? What can I use for these resources? And I'm more than happy to be supportive, but then we lose that data, we lose that support, and we lose that network because from an ethical standpoint, those higher educational institutions, they must hold their own cybersecurity measures.
So Lisa, is what you need then a local database that you can use to hold the data that you and others have collected and make it available to anyone who wants to use it? Is that
I would love to. There's, I use GitHub and I use other, resources, but it's like I can't hold it all together myself. I'm a wealth of information. I'm more than willing. That's why I said thank you so much for having this CSA platform, because otherwise I cannot share with others just saying, here's my Gmail address. It's kind of like, okay, I have the wealth and environmental information from the Northeast all the way to the Southeast, all the way to the Floridian coast. And it's a wealth of information that circles around the Gulf of Mexico. So I have this wealth of information on my external hard drives, but how do I preserve it so that no one else, integrity wise, takes it, massages it, duplicates it, uses it for their research, which is fine. But then, I need an ORCID number, ORC ID number for credit purposes. It's just, there's a lot of stuff happening that just last week broke loose through a 3-hour, 4-hour conversation. And with NASA and NOAA individuals on the call. And we are revisiting the conversation. And it's really, really elevating up the ante.
Lisa, I'm really glad Greg just put in Greg, and I'm glad you changed your name. It was previously identified as SITSI. Greg Newman runs a website called, and does many other things, called sitsi.org, which is a platform that was designed in ways that might address some of the concerns that you're bringing up, Lisa, that houses data collected by volunteers. So the two of you, I think, might want to connect, and you can do that through CSA Connect. But clearly the data lifecycle just touches every single part of citizen science projects, and that design cycle. There's so much that the task that this group has taken on to build just a basic knowledge base of where to start with any of these questions is huge. This field has emerged so quickly and knowledge is building so quickly that even putting everything in a single place for folks to access and start working with is a huge project in and of itself. And then these other things like Vincent that you're talking about, then what do we do with that? How do we use it? How do we make use of it? I think those are additional projects around it, but I'm glad that these rich conversations are starting and that we're making some connections here that can lead to that. So Lisa, definitely connect with Greg, see if there might be something there or some more insights, because I know he's got thoughts on that as well. I do see some chats going on about like a choose your own adventure style to getting into the compendium and doing more with this. I don't know if there are other conversation threads or questions that people had before we formally have to draw this to a close. I don't need to shut the line down. I can stay on a little bit longer. I don't want to assume that Pam and Hillary and others can, but before the time is totally run out. Any other burning questions?
Hey, Jennifer, I just got a comment. First of all, this citizen science community is the bomb, Bombay. Just, I mean, it's allowed a person like me, because I had no idea I would be doing this now, but I'm so glad that I found something that I could spend valuable time in. And Lisa, you said something about, universities and trying to keep their intellectual property. That's something that community has been fighting for years, because the data comes from our neighborhoods, and we really don't get nothing out of it after it's been monetized over and over and over again. So that's one of the biggest problems that we've been trying to work for years. So, but I love this conversation. It's needed and it's a way forward. Don't be afraid to go through the door, because it's something there.
Thanks, Vincent, for your positivity. I will add too that you know, this is a place where lots of people connect around these ideas, and there are related organizations that are deepening some of them. And just quickly to bring up Thriving Earth Exchange, that works directly with communities in support of academics working in service to community projects. So they also have some resources there, and I can drop in a link. Yeah, there's great conversation going on in the chat here too that Pam has added about all of these current standards emerging from federal agencies, state agencies, that make navigating all of this even more complex. So Pam, do you want to say anything about that, since you were just chatting on this? And Greg, thanks for being
it's
here.
just, you know, right as we were finishing up the compendium, EPA came out with their 3 handbooks, and now Hillary's at NOAA helping to develop another set of guidance, and then it sounds like NASA's getting into it too. So just it just makes me worried, and I'm hoping that everybody's looking at each other's. That's all.
I can say, at least for my part, that our goal is to borrow from what's already been developed at the other agencies and not reinvent the wheel. But we do, as NOAA does need to kind of take ownership of these things. And even if we're borrowing other strategies, kind of put them at the forefront of the work that we're doing within our agency. So that's what the strategy and the implementation plan that I mentioned.
I guess part of my personal nervousness is that I direct an EPA funded program that works in NOAA territory offshore. So I'm just worried about, you know, worlds colliding that are going to make things more difficult for our partners, you know, because we're trying to guide the partners that are doing a lot of the monitoring and collecting the data that we use to pull together and tell bigger stories.
I agree. It would be great to kind of cross-reference these federal documents. I do think, speaking for NASA, and I'm not the expert, but I'm getting familiar, there are some peculiarities to how NASA defines citizen science, how NASA does communications, how NASA does some other things. So there are some very NASA policy specific things that need to be addressed. So they do, I think each agency does need some amount of, you know, customized document, but there's certainly a lot of the meat of how do you do this and where do you start when you're designing a project and what do you want to think about. I'm sure we're all drawing from the same peer-reviewed literature and the same resources, but we could probably save each other a little bit of work if we did more talking about it. So Hillary, maybe you and I should get on the phone for a start. And
Hooray.
Pam, if you're talking about the EPA data quality handbook and that whole thing, I am such a fan. That's already in there. I think that bit of work was really phenomenal contribution to the whole field.
Excuse me, this work is so exciting. Tomorrow, just want to let you know, I'm meeting with CQ Director Brenda Mallory. I'm going to be taking her on a toxic tour of Detroit. And I love to mention some of this work, how we doing data and the data ethics and what we doing with metadata. How can we, because they are always using citizen science, but then I don't never see none of us at the table. So, you know, which is something that I'll be free to bring on as long as I have y'all permission to go ahead and move forward. I would definitely share it with her.
Yes.
Thanks, Vincent. Yeah, great to get the word out and share this. Charmel, thanks for being here.
Charmel.
I know there are some folks on who maybe haven't had a chance to chime in either in chat or live. I don't want you to miss out. So if you're here and you have a question, you have something to toss into the mix, please do so.
Michael had a question early on about the EJ screen. that maybe you can give him the 2-sentence description, Vincent.
Well, EJ screen basically is a tool that's made up that all the areas has taken this screening of what are in their areas, what kind of pollutants, because it's going to be moving towards doing some kind of cumulative impacts in different regions, different sections. And the data that they have is good, but I think if it was some way to be able to get that screen and superimpose information that we need to do, like, how many hospital respiratory illnesses are done, or how many dialysis clinic is in a certain area, and the effects of this, it has a lot of possibility how to be able to use all data and mesh them together for positive work. So this just something in a nutshell.
Thanks, Vincent. I know folks are trickling out. Lydia, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you've been on and quiet. Is there anything that you'd want to add in or add?
No, thank you. Just listening, and Vincent said a lot of the things because I come from that community-based perspective, right? And especially communities of color. And so just making sure that as we do any of this work, that we're doing it in ways that will resonate and be beneficial to our communities who are willing to contribute, but want to make sure that whatever is being done aligns with their goals, needs, and is inclusive in that way. So thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Well, great. I know that this is, well, there is a parallel discussion, Lisa, that you just posted in CSA Connect. I think those of you who connected here probably are all in there, looking for community input into terms related to justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, integrity, and funding. It is now JEDI, and I'll put it in here.
And Jennifer,
yes.
I said last night something about illusion. And
Illusion, I saw that.
Yeah, because we asked it for, it's hard to get equity in a situation that's unbalanced and unfair. So
yeah,
that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, and there are so many conversations coming out of that and intersecting in these practices that it's hard to tackle just one when they're tied to all of these others. I really appreciate Pam and Hillary, your focus work on bringing the data resource dimension into this, and appreciating that there are so many pieces and spokes off of this hub that are connected, and that this is a critical piece of that multifaceted program.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if we should have, is there like a group where, well, I guess it's the conference where all the working groups come together, because I know like the ethics working group might be able to give us some additional resources that would fit into one of the data management sections that we're just not aware of.
Yeah,
for example.
And that's a great question. There right now, these monthly conversations that we're having are hosted by working groups, and so we're hoping that some of the cross-pollination can come through there. But yeah, we can do more to facilitate that exchange. And one thing that I can do is just put you directly in touch with that team, who's going to be launching what they have had in the works during one of the spring month conversations, but we can accelerate that with this group.
Cool.
Yeah, I know we're trickling away. And folks have more to get onto. Hillary, did you want to say anything?
Oh, I was just thinking about the law and policy working group too. There's obvious implications for data quality, and to Vincent's very salient point, like action from the data. So what quality do you need in order to influence policy and law, and then what policies and laws are relevant to doing, what standards do you need to meet in order to have the data be admissible for those purposes. And that's something I know we're trying to figure out if there was like a resource that defined that, but it's so agency and dependent, and but maybe there's an opportunity to connect with those folks and bring some of those resources into this work.
Hilly, don't be afraid to say it's bureaucratic. The bureaucratic.
Bureaucratic nightmare.
We're living it.
I'm not
We're
afraid to
living
say
it,
that.
Vincent.
Yep.
I know Hillary and Vincent, and when I tried to explain to people around my community that there were GMOs, genetically modified, mosquitoes that were going to be released, people thought I probably had 3 heads. But, trying to explain about the Zika virus and dengue and these malaria, they're true. They are happening. And wouldn't you know, City of Charleston was the first city across the nation that had 2 Zika viruses announced. And, it's happening.
We need to send out some nanobots out there with some anti-Zika virus so they can attack those viruses on their plane and get rid of all these germs that's hurting us. Just saying.
We need
Mosquito
innovative
homing
ideas.
drones. Yes.
Well, it's really wonderful to meet all of you, and hope to continue the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Everybody take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Bye now.
everybody. Glad
I'm
you're
going to
here.
save this chat before you log us off, Jennifer.
Yeah, yep, feel free. And we'll have the video that will go in. I think these are members only because these are, that's not webinar style. These are conversational. It's a resource generating conversation. So it'll be in the events page and you can.
Yeah, the trouble is when you watch a recording, you don't get to